Well, I have the very real pleasure today of introducing to you Professor John Burt, who received his PhD from Yale University and is currently a professor at Brandeis University. Yesterday, many had the opportunity to listen to his scholarly thoughts during a presentation entitled Lincoln's Dred Scott Speech and the Promise of the Declaration of Independence. Today, we'll enjoy his work as a poet. His most recent poetry book, Victory, is a set of 4 narrative poems exploring incidents in the Civil War, the War of 1812, and World War II. I borrow from the words of his peers to give you a sense of just how well received Professor Burt's work has been. Poet John Hollander has said that these poems, quote, are commanding not only because of the historical knowledge informing them, but for the poet's masterful use of his own mode of blank verse to give an original tone, pace, and vividness to each of his recountings. Harold Bloom adds, quote, John Burt manifests a cognitive power and narrative control very rare in contemporary poetry. Let me quickly note that in addition to scholarly books and articles, John is also the author of 2 other poetry collections and a chapbook, and has edited both the selected and the collected poems of Robert Penn Warren as Warren's literary executor. You won't be surprised to hear that John's stature as a poet has been recognized formally by many awards, of which I mention only a few here, including fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Ingram Merrill Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies. He's received the Holman Prize from the Society for the Study of Southern Literature and the Jules and Francis Landry Prize. I conclude this brief introduction on a more personal note, meant to illustrate John's skill in yet another realm, for in addition to being a fine scholar and a gifted poet, he's an extremely popular teacher and mentor. Once upon a time, I had the great good luck to be able to take a class in American literature from John while working on my PhD at Brandeis University. In his class, love for literature was celebrated with a sharp attention to theme and form, but with an additional astute awareness of history and literature's ethical formative roles in culture and society. His critical touch was light but incisive, often augmented by his generous good humor, illustrative anecdotes, and an undeniable kindness towards those of us struggling to have something meaningful to share. He immediately became a model for me as both teacher and scholar, and it's with considerable gratitude and continued admiration that I welcome him today. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Burt.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank John Talbot and all the organizers of this event, and Brandy Siegfried for that wonderful introduction, and all my friends from the past here. This is really a wonderful venue, a wonderful place to be. I'm going to start with a couple of poems from my cheerfully titled collection, Work Without Hope. I specialize in very cheerfully titled selections. My first book was called The Way Down. My second book was called Work Without Hope. My third book is called Victory, but that's the only one that is actually gloomy. I'd like to start with a brief poem about John Keats from Work Without Hope called Love and Fame. You may remember John Keats wrote a famous sonnet, When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be, where he's worried about what will happen if he dies before he gets all of his poetry out. And some of his descriptions of his poetry are a little bit comic. You know, I have high-piled books full of charactery and symbols. I'm going to write with a lot of symbols. So there is some of Keats's, that quality that Yeats described in Keats of the little boy with his nose pressed up against the window of the candy shop of poetry. But it is also a poem written with the recognition that early death was likely for him, since he was getting TB, which he had got through taking care of his brother in his final illness. There's another detail in that poem, and that is that I understand that he wrote this poem after having been to the Covent Garden Theater, and a strange girl had flirted with him during the intermission. Now, another fact to know about Keats is that rather unlike Shelley and Byron, Keats was rather girl-shy. and I think, and actually it's fair to say homely. And Keats was totally thrilled by this too. So it's not totally clear in that poem whether what he's thinking about is the muse or certain other important females whom he also doesn't know. And in this poem, as he's brooding on this, he has to go take care of his brother. So here we are. She'd smiled as if she knew him. That kept him up and scared him some, but more excited him. And in the dark, while his brother coughed next door, he lay awake, wondering about that girl who'd caught his eye just as she tossed her head to laugh her shy, delicious laugh at what he never learned, then handed him that smile and vanished in the intermission crowd while he just stood there thinking what to say. That's what it's like. That's what it must be like. He hadn't seen it happening to him. They look back at you. That changed it all. But would he ever see that girl again? His brother coughed and choked. He lit the lamp and brought a glass of port to still the spasm. Just stay a bit, John, won't you? Yes, of course. I'm wakeful anyway. Still, I'm sorry. He wiped the sweaty forehead with the sheet. Shh. Go back to sleep. I'll sit a while. Would he have the chance to love that girl, or any of the girls, or are there any, who might look back at him in just that way? It was her gift, a secret, like a poem she might, just from the blue, have handed him, clear and whole, and wholly eloquent, and never to be written, like the rest. At the window, he could count them, 1, then 2, then 3 drops falling in the dark, and to the dark. Stars swept from the sky, flashing downward silently all night. Give me this hour, God, if nothing else. Next, I'd like to read the title poem of Work Without Hope. And just for background information, I have set it in 1946 to imply that the principal character is a war widow. And the premise is that one of the characters is a street person who is walking around the neighborhood looking for yards to rake up. And it's late March or early April, and they're at this house where all last fall's leaves are still there in the yard. So he walks up to the door to ask the lady of the house if he can rake the leaves. And she would have sent him away, except at the very moment he knocks on the door, she has just slapped her daughter right across the face. So she's ashamed and embarrassed of what she's done, so she has to say okay. And the two characters each spend the rest of the poem attempting to avoid becoming the objects of the other's charity. If he had heard the slap, he didn't show. And he was nobody to her, thank God. Her little girl tried and tried to catch her breath, but couldn't. And since he looked at her, clutched a wet, red face against her knee. Still, she was shamed, too shamed to be afraid. Before she'd looked at him, she'd popped the latch as if to make amends for what she'd done. Lady, I can rake this yard real good. He scratched a bleeding knuckle aimlessly and nodded calmly at the flagrant yard. She took her time. He's drunk at 10 o'clock. And yet he seemed so sure of what she'd say. She felt she was the one left hanging there. All right, she said, $2 when you're done. The rake lay on its back behind the house, and on its hook, the rusting hand mower which she could never lift. He saw that, too. And then she knew just why he'd picked out her. The daughter whimpered, running from the room. What good will raking do? He ought to mow, and I'm a fool to fail to ask him to. But he pulled clean and steady, combed the grass, working from the fence out to the street, without a word, without a glance at her. Where does he sleep? She had to wash a glass for lemonade. I should give him beer. To give him anything would ease her mind. But when he saw her standing on the stoop, the lemonade in hand, he waved her off. "I'll drink it when I'm done." "The ice'll melt." "I can't have it till I'm done," I said. She stared. "I have to work before I eat." "All right." "I have to walk and find some work. Then I can eat." This to himself, not her. Inside the door, she tucked in strands of hair and watched him heap the rotten leaves in piles. Then all at once she saw him stop and bend, and gingerly, between two fingers, lift poor blackened Raggedy Ann out of the leaves. Just as he dropped her in the trash, he saw that she was watching him. He met her look, walked right up to the stoop and propped the rake, then slowly, in one swallow, drained the glass. Then he turned down the walk. "Wait a minute." But when she came out, fumbling with a bill, he turned the corner. "Wait, damn you, wait!" She followed him out to Mount Auburn Street, but stopped. A bus went by, 2 kids on trikes. She just couldn't run past all those lawns. She watched his shoulders work his damp gray shirt, and then behind her, finally, she heard the little girl wailing in her room. "Christ," she turned. "I'm coming." Jesus Christ. Later, she looked for him. She looked a week before she found him snoring in the dust between the river and the arsenal. She stood there with the money in her hand. Okay, and one last poem from Work Without Hope. And this is a poem called What Ellen Said. And I picked it because this is a particular challenge to read aloud, because one of the characters says something in this poem, and you're not supposed to be able to quite parse what it means. Is she responding to his question? Is she refusing to answer his question? Has she actually even heard his question? We just don't know that. And of course, when you read it aloud, you kind of have to read it aloud in a way that chooses between those 3 possibilities, which I had worked very hard to keep open. In the poem, an elderly woman is dying, and her husband is trying to ask her whether it's been worth it living with him all these turbulent years. There's a later time when he is looking into the bathroom mirror sometime after her death, when he's trying to figure out what it meant, what she said when he asked that question. And there is another time when the son, who has arrived just too late, and he are mulling over the event of that earlier evening. So this is called What Ellen Said. She hadn't said it. What was it she said? He leaned both hands there on the sink and watched that pale, thin face regard him stupidly, an old man running water from the tap, as if to fill the cup he wouldn't take. It had not changed. That disappointed him. Then nothing ever leaves a mark on me. The boy, he knew, had drifted back to sleep in what was still his room, unused a while. "She was glad you came," he'd tried to say. I'm not sure she saw me. "Yes, she did. I'm sure she did." "We can't know that, Pop. I didn't even see her move her lids." They'd sat an hour. "Pop, let's go to sleep," he'd said at last, like talking to a child. "There's nothing we can do now anyway." "I'm okay. You sleep. I won't be long." The faucet spluttered. Across the hall, she lay, as he had left her, in her little room. That night, before he'd called the boy, he'd asked again and again, "Ellen, are you there?" Her eyes were closed. He knew she was awake. "Ellen, has it been worth it after all?" He knew she was awake. She closed her eyes. "I have to know." "Oh, God," she said at last. And that was it. Later, her breathing changed. He turned the water off. The house was cold, and nothing happened. Nothing ever would. Okay, well, that will do for Work Without Hope. I'm going to read you a few poems from Victory, my most recent book of poems. One of the nice things about publishing a book of poems is that Christmas you know you have something to give to everybody that you know they don't already have. You don't know they'll be glad to have it, but you know they don't have it already. I'm going to read the opening poem of this book, which is called The Passing of the Armies. And there's some background information to give about that poem. The speaker is a Union officer named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And those of you who have studied the Civil War know who he is, right? If you've studied the Battle of Gettysburg, you know that the Union position was this big fish hook from Culp's Hill all the way down here to Little Round Top. And you probably know that on the second day, the Union Army left Little Round Top undefended. And discovering that, they rushed troops there at the last minute. And at the very far left of the line was Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's regiment, the 20th Maine. So he was one of the men who saved the Union cause at Gettysburg, a cause that needed a lot of saving on that day. In this poem, he actually wrote a book called The Passing of the Armies, which is not about Gettysburg, but about Appomattox, because he was formerly the officer to whom Lee actually surrendered. And he describes this event where he's marching his troops home from Appomattox, and they march after dark because they're in a rush to get back to Washington by some such time or other. And so they don't know really where they are. And he is awakened because it turns out that he's camped on a place where there are lots of shallowly buried dead bodies that turn out to be his own troops that they left behind in a chaotic retreat in 1862. So it's, this really happened. And I also, in the poem, there's two quotations from Thucydides. I wrote about it because Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was an English professor, right? So when the war broke out, he asked his dean, "Can I go raise a regiment?" And I said, "No way." "Oh, well, can I have a leave of absence to go study in France?" "Oh, yes, you can do that." And suddenly went and raised the regiment. Anyway, he's thinking of two famous passages from Thucydides. The first of them is the famous description of the destruction of the Athenian army at the siege of Syracuse, which was really the turning point in the Peloponnesian War that meant that Athens was probably going to be destroyed. And the other is the what's called the Melian Dialogue, which was the Athenians' debate with the chief men of the island of Melos, whom they had gone to conquer. I mean, one of the grubby parts about the Athenians is that the way they earned all their money was by capturing foreign cities and demanding ransom from them. So the Melians come out and they say, "Well, don't you think we ought to argue about the right and wrong about this?" And the Athenians say, "Arguments about right and wrong are the way that weak people talk strong people down." So your choice is to surrender now and we'll let some of you live, or not surrender and we'll let none of you live. None of them wound up living. So Chamberlain is wondering, obviously, to what extent the American democracy is going to go the way of the Athenian democracy. And, the question is left open. Lincoln has just been assassinated when this poem is spoken. So here we go. Oh, one more thing I need to describe. The repeating dream he has is at a place called Falling Waters, which is a ford on the Potomac River. And he is remembering how after Gettysburg, the two armies sort of faced off with each other at this ford. And the Union Army, many people say, blew a chance to end the war by capturing Lee on this side of the Potomac. And he's remembering Lee's army getting across the Potomac in his repeated dream. And obviously the point of the repeated dream is, well, I guess this war is never going to end. He was at Falling Waters in a dream. The horses picked their way on shuddering planks and clambered up the rubble on the shore under the furtive sibilance of leaves. Gaunt riders whispered in moon-spattered dark, drew into shadows, noiseless, shifting, mortal. Each time he knew how it would go. First scouts, then skirmishers, and then, all through the night, the wary, tireless regiments of shades, Lee's men, groping back from Gettysburg, slipping the trap, escaping into war, while he was huddled, silent, miserable, and rooted terribly upon that bank. At Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, that steaming night in front of Reeves' Redoubt, where as he bled through stinking bandages and orderlies pulled dead men off the cots, his broken boys, tangled between the lines, moaned all night for water, for their mothers, for someone to crawl out beneath the guns and blow their brains out. Jesus, do it now. Or in the hospital at Maryland, he'd watched those riders feeling their way out. And now again, the war all over with, and Lincoln in his grave, he had that dream outside of Richmond, marching his troops home. Someone was shaking him. Sir? Okay, what is it? I'm sorry, sir, it's just your horse again. What spooked him now? He's kicked Lieutenant Keene. He hurt him? No, but he's just getting started. We thought you'd know the way to talk him down. All right, I'll see to him. And thought, my horse. 5,000 men do what I tell them to, but not my horse. And he could hear the stamping as he eased his sore feet into boots 30 yards away, the snort and whinny of a horse about to rear, the murmured, easy, as the orderly edged closer, easy now, crooning, wheedling, the straining self-control no horse could fail to see through and disdain. It's all right, Joe, he called out from the tent, and stepped into the smoky, moonlit camp they'd pitched in darkness, hungry and annoyed to march so hard in peacetime and so long to God knows where. Near Hanover, he guessed. A dozen campfires smoldered past the trees, red halos in the distance. The surgeon's lamp inside his rotten tent cast silhouettes, but no light near. He saw the shadows scuffling, peered hard a second, then came trotting out in darkness through the brittle, ragged pines. Their needles, thick and soft, gave underfoot and stayed him with their clean and bitter smell. Then something grabbed him. Something underground reached up and took his ankle, pitched him down hard in the leaf meal, wrenched him to his knees. He stood, brushed his trousers sheepishly. General, I'm all right. Look, my God. And there was what he'd stepped in, a dead man's heart, the broken bone house just beneath the leaves. And then his horse kicked loose what made him rear, a half-crushed skull he'd pawed up from the dirt. Before the horse was calmed, they'd found 10 more, a bayonet, a buckle from a belt, a blue cap with a little 2 attached. All round he saw, as the moon washed through the clouds, the pale ribs swamped in litter, drifting there like spars and tackle shattered in the surf. This was Peake's Crossing, a little fight, their first. These were his townsmen from the 2nd Maine, left in the night retreat 3 years ago. They had not in the dark known where they were, and in the light might not have recognized that muddy hedgerow where they'd stood their ground, ramming muskets through the tangled brush till night fell down and both sides slipped away. Now, on their way to life again, they met their other selves, still waiting in Death's Harbor for the long, slow crossing into nothingness. And they were nothing too, stone blank and spent, sick with war and mystified with peace. If this was peace, this armistice with death. Next morning, as they marched, their fractured salvage stowed in cracker boxes one by one, bands of ragged freedmen trailed them, laughing, cheering, begging food and shoes, half-starved. What will they do, he thought. How will they live? Will anyone remember how to live? He passed each gutted house, each gullied field, a sprout with burdock, thistle, clouts of brush. Each one, he thought, is rooted in a man. Dimly in dark after the harbor fight, how often he had parsed this passage out in freezing classrooms full of eager kids. Demosthenes and Nicias could see, in twos and threes with every soughing swell, white, swollen bodies of Athenian boys swept up the sand with flopping, outstretched arms, then dragged back down into the bitter foam. The Syracusans sealed the harbor mouth and sent detachments out to block the fords. The ships were gone. They had not men enough, unless they drained the courage of despair, to force their way by land that night and flee the chains of those they came to put in chains. But nothing less could save that army now. Each man left his dead there for the crows, the laughing ones, the pluckers out of eyes. And knowing what would happen soon enough, abandoned too their wounded in the tents. All those too weak to go clung to their necks as men in shipwrecks clutch and drown their friends. But fearing worse, their brothers shook them off and marched to meet next night defeat and shame. He shook himself and tried to turn his mind to Brunswick. Maybe he would teach again. Teach what? What did he know that mattered now? To Fanny, but not a single word came back of her last letter, pale and general as letters turn when nothing is to say. We had no thought that war would master us, would lay to waste what war was meant to save. Down Pennsylvania Avenue next week, our shades will march in triumph in our place, still tempting us as more and less than men, still taunting us with what we have become. Destiny, not men, will rule us now. That goddess freshened with the taste of blood, whose many names are synonyms for death. Now every man goes tense for the command he serves, is driven by, but cannot fathom, past all knowing, past all right and wrong, swept up in something grim and great and fatal, till he is nothing but what he is in fire, and freedom bends itself back into force. Every spirit builds itself a house, and in it builds an altar to necessity. For our part, look, we'll skip speech number 1, how Athens drove the Persians from your gates, so you owe her your freedom. Give it here. We'll keep your freedom safe for you for sure. For your part, spare us all that rhapsody, how Sparta has no stake here anymore, or how you mean us well if left alone. That kind of talk's for equals, not for you. You know we'll take your city in a week. Spare us the effort and we'll let you live. At least we have the honor to be frank, so don't pretend the gods are judging us as if a human quarrel bothered them. If what we do were any grief to Zeus, he could have stopped us any time he wished. Gods don't take sides until it's over with. They're just like us. They conquer when they can and love those most who make the most of chance. That chance that you'd have taken if you could. Don't tell us otherwise. We too were weak and made the little speeches you've rehearsed and talked down other cities, till in time we had the force to use more forthright means. Another day may come, and when it does, we'll take it as we have to, just like you. Behind him rolled the dust, all gold and blaze. Ahead lay Washington, half swamp, half shrine. Well, I hope you hear the fear there that the American Revolution will repeat the course of the French Revolution, to go from Gironde to terror to Napoleonic Empire. That was a live fear, and that, of course, is the fear that's going to come back in the poem I'm going to read at the end of the reading about Joel Barlow's embassy to Napoleon. But I think I'm going to read a section of another poem first, and this is a poem about this ship. This is a U.S. Liberty ship, the SS Sumner Kimball. This picture was taken during a North Atlantic storm 500 miles northeast of Newfoundland by the U-boat captain who sank it. And the story is that usually if you take a torpedo in the North Atlantic, you go straight down to Davy Jones' locker. But this guy managed to duck in and out of fog banks and storm showers and managed to fight off the U-boat for 12 to 18 hours and 3 times almost ran it down. And in the photograph, you can see he's trying to run the U-boat down. Now, this story survives. All the American characters were killed. And the story chiefly survives because the U-boat captain wanted it remembered. So what I'm going to start with is just the opening section of the poem, and then I'll read a little bit from the end, where 50 years later, the captain of the U-boat's daughter is trying to figure out what happened. And she has hired a retired sea captain who knows how to trace the naval records to find the logbook of the U-boat that sank her father's Liberty ship. It didn't matter that for 50 years she'd pictured just that scene in her mind's eye. 7 men on a raft off Newfoundland. These men were real. The men who took this shot, who put them there, who left them there, was real. She dropped the paper, sat down on the stoop. This is what she knew, O'Leary's daughter. One winter night in 1944, her father's ship, a brand new Liberty, empty, steaming home from Liverpool, straggled from its convoy and went down. Sanford Kendall, overdue New York, the telegram repeated in her mind, presumed lost with all hands on 1/16. She was 10, and he was 50 then, and lost at sea meant still alive to her, like being lost in woods or in a crowd. Straggled was the word that rankled her, as if he'd been too lazy to keep up, as if he'd dawdled coming home from school. She wouldn't let them tell her what they meant, and even now that she had reached an age he never reached, she saw him still at night, spotting something through binoculars, saw him recognize just what it was, and freeze a second, knowing what was next. But worse still was the thought that he'd survived that first explosion in the engine room. The dawn had found him drifting like these 7. The death had straggled, too, and made them beg, had waited till their courage had run out, weakening with cold for miserable hours. One man was pointing, tugging at the sleeve of a tall one next to him, an officer, both looking bleakly in the camera's face. Look, there he is. They see us, over there. They'd only seen the periscope just then, through which the U-boat captain took that shot. Not surfacing, there might be seaplanes near, but catching them just as they saw him turn. The sailor, urgent, just about to shout. The officer just glaring, unsurprised. The other 5 not even turning round, frozen and afraid and blank on that blank sea. They all had names. She saw them listed there. Even the U-boat captain had a name. Had sometime left all his effects ashore before he too was sunk, the story said. And in some basement file in Maryland, this photograph, amid a pile of charts, invoices, manifests, and weather maps, swept up from the naval yard at Brest, had sat uncatalogued since '44, till Captain Harrison, she wrote the name, looking for his friends, had found them there. This is what she knew, that late that night there'd been a call for help, and 2 corvettes had beaten their way all night through heavy seas, to find no trace of her, no plank, no slick, the ocean-colored sky, the empty heave of empty, repetitious wave on wave. And when the weather cleared next day, all day, a liberator out of Greenland crossed and banked and lumbered back and banked and drew a polygon in nowhere hopelessly, while 3 keen pairs of weary eyes kept watch as the radar stroke beat time or spyglass sought the faintest phosphorescence of a wake. And back on shore, nudging rows of dials, they strain to catch a static scattered sound, or overhear a U-boat in a burst of enigmatic clatter make report. After a while, they turned to other things, sought other nameless men to save or kill. And war closed up behind them like the sea behind a ship, or on it, the strangling water. From past the cold, salt wiping out of lives, no story reached her. That is what she knew. But what is there to know, she asked herself. What does it matter, the things I haven't seen? I've seen it all 1,000 times by now, and I can't change it. I can't save his ship. I can't comfort him. If he was brave, I can't tell, and none of this will tell. And yet that hopeless picture stayed with her and kept her up at night. She had to know. So having seen this picture of the abandoned ship crewman being left behind by the U-boat captain, she hires this man to track down the logbook of the ship that sank her father's ship. And now I'm just going to read you what he is, the end of the poem. The U-boat is commanded by a man named Lieutenant Metzger. I just picked that name because it means butcher. Now, given the fact that the actual U-boat captain was tremendous help to me, I wish I had given him a more sympathetic name and had portrayed him more sympathetically in the poem. Let me see where I'll start. Okay, I'll start with Metzger here. Metzger was hard put to keep his trail. The sleet would rise, the ship would disappear. In half an hour, he'd see it somewhere else. Twice he tried to contact Lorient, reporting back the weather in a burst, with no acknowledgement that he was heard. He thinks that his antennas are submerged, that no one hears him. He can't hear a thing. Taps steamer, unescorted. Still not heard. Oh, I have to pause. There's something I have to explain to you. The Liberty ship is going to send a few messages in code. KLDW means I am the Liberty ship Sumner I. Kimball. DD means I have been torpedoed. The numbers he keeps sending out are his latitude and longitude, and that's meant to be a sort of chorus that's going on through the back of the poem. He sees the steamer pulling off to starboard, then loses her again in fog and snow, guesses wrong which way she'll go, pulls up, can barely even match the steamer's speed. He isn't sure just what he's dealing with. He tries again, reporting back to home. Beta, U-960, Metzger. Position AK-8548. Barometer 980 millibars and falling. Try doing that in iambic pentameter. And falling. Wind southeast, force 12, seas 8. Visibility 3 miles in squalls. Unescorted steamer, course southwest. Deckhouse center, armed, 1 stack, 3 cranes. Looks up the silhouette in Gruner, guesses. US EC2, 7,000 tons. He has it right that time, a Liberty. The bottoms of the troughs are like a well. The steel wall of the wave is all around. He can't see over it. And from the top, before he staggers down into the next, sees long white streaks of foam sweep from the crests. The wave troughs crumble in the gale like surf. Sometimes the plunging shudder knocks him down. He was all alone out there, he knew. There'd be no help if he could score a hit. No plane from Greenland roaring overhead. No swift, slim frigate steaming down his throat. Your father also knew there'd be no help. No trace of him. No corvette 3 miles off. No lifeboat on the wide ways to the sea, if any U-boat saw him flailing there. He'd have put an extra lookout up to spot the wake a conning tower leaves, and kept the gunners at their post all night, strapped in, as death-cold seas broke on the bows, and sleet froze on their jackets and their gloves. What do you see? Nothing, sir. The storm. Sparks? Do you hear someone? Yes, sir. Close by. A steward propping himself in the reeling galley brews a pot of coffee for the bridge. Below, the engine crew in the boiling maze of white, asbestos-shrouded pipes and valves and small round gauges shuddering on stems, the sulfur stink of oil and steam and smoke blackening their faces and their arms, scrambles on the catwalks in the roar, keeps the one huge cylinder at work, pumping like a derrick, the smaller two wheezing and heaving, the shaft still whirling steady and shining like a bolt in that cloudy cell. One man coughs into an oily rag. And in their bunks, the off-watch, still awake, are clutching dirty pillows to tight-clenched eyes and swallowing hard to fight back nausea. They speak to no one to keep their courage up and wonder if they'll make it to the boats. Metzger pulled ahead at last and turned. Just as he'd lined up for a Fäkerschuss, he lost the freighter in a thundercloud. Then suddenly a bow breaks from the fog right in his face. He swerves in panic, clear. Did my father see him? Did he try to run him down? It's hard to say, but I don't think so, no. Perhaps your father heard his radio, but if he did, he would have tried to hide, not pick a fight he couldn't hope to win. Still, Metzger says he didn't veer away, but kept on bearing down with all he had. I think he knew a sub was after him, but saw him only just when he was seen and ran him down on impulse, his last chance, since luck had dropped him right in Metzger's lap. He came so close his gunners couldn't fire. They couldn't get their muzzles down to shoot. As Metzger passed head on, just yards away. And when he cleared, he had a stroke of luck. His angle was too steep for Metzger's fish, and so slipped back in fog as Metzger turned. From there, he would have veered to hide his tracks and leave the U-boat guessing where he'd gone. Metzger seems quite sure he tried to ram. He would have known what he was up against. He lost the trail in fog 3/4 hours, and just past 9:30, Metzger caught a glimpse. The Kendall beating straight across his stern 800 yards away. He just can't miss. But then he doesn't say just where he'd hit or give the height of the detonation column. Steamer turns to starboard and drives on. He didn't sink her? No, there's something strange. Perhaps the warhead didn't blow. Perhaps the fish punched through, just as it did with me. Enemy has sharply reduced speed. They can't abandon ship in waves like that. Some kind of hell had broken loose, she thought, upon that bridge that bitter winter night. All through the voice pipes, he could hear men scream. A forward gunner is swept overboard, and the bow has canted down a few degrees. The helmsman struggles off the heeling deck and takes the wheel. Christ, Jesus Christ. But the shaft is turning still, and the Kendall swims. Metzger tries to pull ahead again, gets overeager, misses twice, falls back, has trouble loading up the forward tubes. O'Leary slips away in a shroud of sleet, and Metzger follows. He can't see a thing. They dance this minuet till almost 12. Then suddenly, 100 yards away, the Kendall turns to face him in the surge, and Metzger barely dodges her. She's gone, but no mistake this time what he's doing. An hour passes with no sign of her, and then a heaving shadow crosses his T. This time he hits her in the engine room. A second blast goes up, blows out a hatch. The Kendall slews off sideways, dead in the water. Then Metzger picks up something on his radio. 3 quick little tones. SSS, 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 KLDU, DE, torpedoed, SSS, 5240, N, 35, W. The tones go out to nowhere through the storm. Metzger waits 400 yards away, hearing the blurry melody of code, and nothing happens. The Kendall wallows, drifts, ships a wall of ocean, shrugs it off, reels backwards in the swells, then rights herself. He sees men scurrying on deck. The smoke pours out and bellies down. A hose cocks up and plays across the stern part of the bridge. Then, someone standing on the wheelhouse ring, watching the fire crew struggling with the hose, looks off to port, sees Metzger rolling there, and coolly brings binoculars to his eyes. Then 4 bells passes and the smoke subsides. The fingers still are dancing on the key. 5240N 35W. No boats are lowered. SSS KLDU. At last, Metzger submerges to reload. When he pops up, a light shows on the bridge. Metzger writes that he attacked again, but that's not just the word for it. 3 times he slams torpedoes in from point-blank range to no effect, like sabering a cow. Just after 3, the Kendall breaks in half. The stern drifts off. The bow floats, the bow cants up, and Metzger steams around it, sees no boats. Was that the end? No, there's one thing more. He got a message off that morning, finally, the weather calming down just after dawn, and right away picked up an aircraft radar, so crashed dove with his message incomplete. He didn't know if his report was heard. 6 hours later, having lost the plane, he gets an urgent message from BDU. Could sunken ship have been our Rio Grande? A blockade runner sunk the week before. Return at once to site and find debris. It's late on the 18th when he gets back. And there he finds the bow still floating, empty, smoke-stained and tilting backwards crazily, rolling like an iceberg in the dark. It wasn't till half a year had passed that after midnight, starting from her sleep, she knew just who it was that Metzger saw, watching from the wheelhouse evenly, raising his binoculars to meet that face that watched him from the conning tower. How he'd have looked the U-boat up and down, still and calm and perfectly detached, as if already looking down from death. Okay, now I'm going to end with an even more dark, gross poem. And I'll give you a little bit of the background information. There is a minor 19th century American poet named Joel Barlow, whom you may know for his one good poem called The Hasty Pudding, or from his very bad poem called The Vision of Columbus. He had a second career as a diplomat. He had been sent to negotiate for the freedom of the Barbary pirates in the 1790s. And he freed the American sailors from the Barbary pirates by giving the pirates exactly what pirates most want, an American-built frigate. It doesn't strike me as a terribly smart deal, but at any rate, in 1811, the United States was on the point of declaring war simultaneously on Britain and on France, which was not the greatest thing for a power with 2,000 men in its army and 7 ships in its navy to do. So because Barlow was known in France, he sent Barlow to negotiate a treaty with Napoleon, who had no need of the love of the United States and wouldn't meet with him. But then Napoleon launched the invasion of Russia, and Barlow figured if something bad happens to Napoleon in Russia, he'll need the friendship of the United States. So he chased Napoleon off into Russia, got swept up in the retreat from Moscow, and died of pneumonia in the chaos of the retreat from Moscow. During which, in the last 2 weeks of his life, he wrote his one actually really great poem, a poem called Advice to a Raven in Russia, which I quote in here, in which the key image, an image that you'll notice I gave you in the first poem in this book, is a raven is trying to pluck the eyes out of a dead man but can't do it because they've frozen. So this is the poem is a series of letters that Barlow is sending back to his wife, and this last one that he doesn't send, I've written in terza rime just because it's Dante's meter, and Barlow is in a desperate situation. So, Joel Barlow to Ruth Barlow, December 9th, 1812, Grodno, not delivered. He had been in Vilnius, which is where the all the diplomats were. And just a few days before, there'd been a big party to celebrate Napoleon's becoming an emperor. And Barlow had been there flirting with countesses, and he described this flirtation to his wife because she knew he wasn't serious, particularly since the countess turned out to be 80. He'd save that little punchline for the end of the letter. And as they're reeling out of the party, not completely sober, the remnants of Napoleon's army begin to creep into the city, and they realize, oh my God, we've got to get out of here. So this is the next sequence and the last sequence as he's making his escape from Vilna. 3 miles from Vilna, there's a long, low ridge I since have learned is called Ponari Hill. When I came in, I didn't notice it, since from the west its slope is gradual. The eastern side is steep and strewn with rocks, about like our old path by Whaley Mill to Judge's Cave, where you and I have walked hot August noons in half an hour or so, carrying picnic lunches on our backs. Our road was slick with ice and trampled snow. We picked our way with care on level ground, then turned up to the woods, switched back and forth, each bend a little steeper, till we found the slope all blocked with wreckage, thickly spilled from the laden carriages, bogged, then overturned, of all the diplomats who'd thronged to Vilna. Their horses were all smooth-shod, foundering there. It was our small but thorough Berezina. That's the river where Napoleon's army was destroyed. A gilded coach would slither, its ponies stare. One falls, and then another in the path. Senseless, still in trammels, gasping for air. The whole route stops. The teamsters, further back, if the pony can't be whipped up to its feet, wrestle the coachman from his seat and drag the whole equipment off into the trees. They kick it over, taking what they find to overload their own exhausted teams. The passengers just sit down on the ground, farther behind and deeper in the shade, too numb, too frightened even to complain, just waiting for the Cossacks or the cold. I sat there, hopeless. I saw there, hopeless, huddled on his side, our Dane, von Walterstorff, watching the road, among a crowd too spent to beg a ride. I jumped outside and floundered through the drifts and shook him hard until he blinked his eyes. I dragged him up and wouldn't let him sit. He slumped down to his knees and tried to crawl. Tom lugged him on his shoulders to the carriage. Just as I turned to climb back in, I saw Supine, propped at an angle like a chair, pulled backwards by his pack from off a log, a dead, fresh Württemberger grenadier, in a spotless sky blue coat. His epaulets still shone. He could not have been dead an hour. A raven settled down upon the face and pecked, but couldn't take the eyes. He shifted, tried to set his claws in place, and worked at prying off the brittle nose, but got no purchase. Again and again his beak glanced off that frozen and still open eye. I heard a clatter as his footing slipped, then tick, just like an empty pistol snap. Tick, tick, then silence. Tick, 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 tick. At last the bird let go and clambered up. Thank you very much.